This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
Welcome to the monthly public lecture of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. Thank you all for coming. The Vegetarian Society of Hawaii is a not-for-profit, volunteer organization founded in 1990 to promote human health, animal rights, and protection of the environment by means of vegetarian education. It's among the largest vegetarian societies in the nation. Refreshments tonight are courtesy of down-to-earth natural foods. We hope you'll stay after the talk and try some delicious vegan food. Tonight's lecture will be videotaped for broadcast on the VSH weekly TV series, Vegetarian. On Oahu, the program airs on Thursdays at 6 p.m. on Olelo Channel 52. Please feel free to record our shows for future viewing. We would also like to encourage you to visit the Vegetarian Society's website, vsh.org. That's vsh.org. It is now time for our special guest. We're delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Will Tuttle, Ph.D. Dr. Tuttle, an acclaimed pianist, composer, educator, and author, has lectured and performed widely throughout North America and Europe. His doctorate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, focused on educating intuition in adults, and he has taught college courses in creativity, humanities, mythology, religion, and philosophy. He is a recipient of the Peace Abbey's Courage of Conscience Award and is a Dharma Master in the Zen tradition. Tonight, Dr. Tuttle will discuss the main ideas of his book, The World Peace Diet. Please welcome Dr. Will Tuttle.
So, how's everybody doing here tonight? You doing well? Thank you, all of you, really, for joining us this evening. I'm really honored to be here. I'm delighted, actually, to be here, to be able to talk to you about what I think is the most important thing that we can talk about at this point in our culture's journey. Basically, what I'll be doing, I'll just hold it up here. This is the book that was mentioned, The World Peace Diet, and that I wrote, and I'll be talking about the main ideas in the book. How many of you in here think that you've been following the whole food system, the dilemmas of the food system, the costs, the violence in the food system? How many of you know about that? You think you know about it pretty well? Yeah. How many people don't want to hear anything about that at all? A few people. How many people don't ever raise your hand? Quite a few. I know. I really feel, every day that goes by, more and more, that our culture is in a crisis. And I think you probably feel the same way. I mean, I think anyone who's moderately has their finger on the pulse of what's going on the planet right now knows that the underlying assumptions of this culture cannot continue much longer. And so what I would like to do is tell you my take, basically, on the situation and specifically how it relates to food, and specifically how it relates to the routine mistreatment of animals for food in this culture. And so the basic idea that I'd like to share with you is that all of us are born into a culture that has a hidden underlying mentality, and that it is essentially a taboo to discuss this at all in our culture because a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons, I think, is that at a deep level, people in our culture feel very guilty, actually, or have an essential feeling of ill-ease about what we're doing to 75 million animals every single day in the United States. I'll talk mainly just about the United States. We're killing 75 million animals a day in the United States for food. And so this is not just a sort of a side, project of this culture. It is, I would say, the primary project of this culture. If someone came from outer space and landed, in the United States and looked around and said, talked to the mothership and stuff. So what are they doing down there? I think the main thing they would say is, they're cutting down they've cut down and are cutting down vast areas of the planet to grow grain, to feed animals, which they eat, and roughly 1 billion people on the planet are starving or malnourished, can't get enough to eat, and roughly 1 billion are obese and overweight, and the primary driving force behind this whole thing is feeding massive amounts of grain to animals who are hyper-confined and brutalized and killed and create enormous diseases in the population that eat them. So this is really, I would say, the main thing that's happening, and yet it's not talked about. I mean, we just seem to be incapable in our culture of actually making the connections between the dots of what we're doing to animals for food, what we're doing to the environment, what we're doing to our health. What the World Peace Diet focuses on is those things, but much more than that. How does that affect us spiritually? How does it affect us socially and culturally, the history and anthropology, the big picture, really, of this whole routine mistreatment of animals for food? So that's what I'd like to get into this evening. And the basic thing for me is that there really is just absolutely nowhere near enough time for me to convey to you all the information that I would like to convey in merely 1 hour. I recently put the World Peace Diet onto an audio book, and it's 13 and a half hours long, and I never repeat anything ever in the book. That's what the editors did. They shortened it down, so they say never repeat anything. So what ends up happening is I feel I start talking faster and faster and faster as the time goes on, because there's just so much that I feel I want to convey, and I still cannot do that. But what I'll try to do, I guess, essentially, is just touch on what I feel are the main points here, and hope that you will continue to do your own research. I think this is the kind of thing, for me anyway, I found, I've been a vegan for 29 years, and find that even today, there's just, every day that goes by I'm learning more. There's always more to learn about this subject. It's incredibly fascinating. I think it's incredibly liberating also to deepen our understanding of the ramifications of our mistreatment of animals for food. I'd like to begin actually with one other thing, which is to just actually invite all of us to just take a moment and just turn our attention within and just feel our connection with this beautiful earth, this beautiful planet. Feel our love for this earth, feel our love for the human beings that we share this planet with, and for the animals that we share this planet with, and for the future generations who are depending on us, actually, for the state of things here. And feel the love we have for our loved ones, for ourselves, for the whole web of life, for the infinite source of all life. And just give thanks for the understanding that we are part of an awakening on this planet of human consciousness. All the ripples that radiate from our being together this evening will be to bring peace and healing to this world. And so it is. So, I think the bottom line really is to begin to question the underlying assumptions of this culture. In the World Peace Diet, I call that leaving home. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go home after this lecture and say, everybody, okay, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm going to leave home and really transform my life. But what leaving home means in the Buddhist tradition, I think actually in the Christian tradition and other traditions, is simply to question the underlying assumptions of the culture. And this culture has underlying assumptions that are extremely devastating to not only the outer environment, but to the inner environment. And I'll just say briefly what those assumptions are. The main underlying assumption, I would say, is that our culture has a mentality of reductionism at its core, that we routinely reduce beings to things, to commodities that we use. That this mentality of reductionism is ritually injected into each and every one of us as we grow up in this culture, by every institution in this culture, by the family, education, government, the media, corporations, religion. All the institutions in our culture are utterly unanimous in this basic perspective, and so there's no escape from this. And it's a mentality of reductionism, of commodification. Also, it's a mentality essentially of elitism and of privilege, because we're taught, again, early on, by being forced essentially to eat the flesh and secretions of animals that are brutalized routinely, that certain beings are just inherently above others, that there's this sort of hierarchy of value depending on your outer, you know what it is, right? Male, female, race, income, age, species, and when you get down to the bottom there and you're a chicken or a pig or a turkey or a duck or a fish. And the thing to understand at the core of this whole thing is that all beings have interests. All beings have interests. Their interests are to them as important to them as my interests are to me. The interest of not having my body confined, having my baby stolen, having my freedom taken away, having my body killed, mutilated. All the things that we do routinely to animals, we would not want them done to us. And this is the essential thing. So in order to do them en masse to so many millions of people, we have to disconnect from our essential compassion for other living beings. And the essential teaching of all the spiritual traditions is that when you hurt someone else, you hurt yourself more. The essential teaching is whatever we would most want for ourselves, we should give to others. If we want to be loved, we should be loving. If we want to have freedom, we should let others be free. If we want to be blessed, then to bless others. This is the foundation of basic sanity. This is our essential true nature shining forth, and yet we're born into a culture that acts and essentially injects into all of us, through all the systems of the culture, a mentality that is totally opposite of this. And it does it mainly through the food. Through eating, the actual ritual act. Anthropologists know, for example, that if you want to understand a culture, you look at the food. And if you want to know the way that any culture transmits all its mores and values and norms from one generation to the next, look at the food, because food is our most intimate connection with the larger order. It's where we partake of the infinite mystery, the infinite life feeding itself through itself. It's this incredible, mind-blowing thing when we're eating and life is feeding life. And so this is our most intimate connection with nature, with our culture, with our families, with everything. And the values and actions and behaviors surrounding that activity are pivotal in any culture. And what we have in this culture is an abysmal situation, really, where we have whole armies of our brothers and sisters that are doing work that we would never want to do. They are the ones that are forced to hyper-confine, mutilate, and slaughter and kill animals. I've been to these places. Madeline and I have traveled to slaughterhouses, factory farms, stockyards. You see these places, you see the people that work there. These are the people, whole armies of our brothers and sisters who are doing work that we would never want to do. These are the people that have the highest suicide rates, the highest drug addiction, alcoholism, spousal abuse rates. And Martin Luther King said something very profound. He said, "Violence anywhere hurts everyone everywhere. We are all connected." And so if we are so naive as a culture to think that we can have, large parts of our culture where we pay people to bring out the worst in them, to be able to just heartlessly stab and kill and maim and mutilate other living beings, and that doesn't affect all of us. It does affect all of us. It creates, in a sense, a prayer. Our actions are prayers, our thoughts are prayers, and it creates really a prayer for violence. So we have to understand that when we take out our wallets and we pay for the flesh or the secretions of animals, that we're paying someone somewhere to do something horrific, and that animals are terrified and brutalized, and that there's this whole, basically it's like a vast system that is only in place for one reason, because people pay for it. Consumers choose to buy it. And so what I'm talking about tonight is veganism as an ancient core of sanity in the human experience. It's another name for ahimsa. For example, ahimsa means nonviolence. The idea with ahimsa is that we will never be happy, we will never be free, we will never find inner peace as long as we're violent to other living beings. This is basic sanity. And yet, this is something that, again, we're taught as little kids through the initiations of these mealtime rituals to dominate and exploit other living beings. So it's a mentality, as I was saying, of commodification and disconnected and exploitation, but also of disconnectedness. I want to add that in there. Disconnectedness is rampant in this culture, and it's because, again, we don't want to connect really with what we're doing when we eat animal foods. We'd rather not make the connection. My mother did not say when I was a little kid growing up, well, good morning, we're having the flesh of a brutalized animal this morning. It's like, never say that, we're having bacon. So we have all these euphemisms. So we learn, though, the point I'm making is we learn early on to disconnect what's actually happening and disconnect from what's actually happening. And so there's an old saying that Madeline taught me. This is Madeline, by the way. She's sitting over here. Let's give Madeline a big hand. She's the, power behind everything I'm saying here. She's also the artist of these paintings. She does lots of paintings of wild, what we call wild. I mean, it's so funny to call them wild, but they're just living their lives on the planet. But anyway, wild animals. Wild animals are being devastated by us eating animal foods. So that's an essential point I think we have to make. But anyway, Madeline taught me a saying in German. She's from Switzerland. Übung macht den Meister. That means practice makes the master. And we practice, unfortunately, in this culture, the art of disconnecting. From an early age, we practice disconnecting the reality that's on our plate from the reality that it actually took to get it onto our plate. So we become, as a culture, masters of disconnecting. And we can basically be destroying rainforests, be destroying oceans, be creating systems where people are starving to death needlessly, where our young people are committing suicide, and we just disconnect. We just don't think about it. We just are so good at disconnecting. And so this is where our innate intelligence gets damaged. The other thing the other underlying mentality actually is it's a mentality of predation. The essential teaching when you give little kids the flesh of animals, that they're essentially predatory. And this is so interesting. I mean, if you look at the situation, we have, just go to a grocery store and look at the baby food jars, and you'll see there's little jars that have veal, chicken, beef, turkey, cheese. That's what little kids get. I mean, I think it's only 5% or so of babies now are actually getting their mother's breast these days. But whether they're getting their breast or whether they're getting a bottle, as soon as they start eating food, they're getting the flesh of animals. That's what they're starting to eat, and by forces that they totally trust. And so when you realize this, I mean, in the research I did on the World Peace Diet, I realized it's almost an utter miracle that anyone ever goes vegan, because the programming is so intense that we're essentially predatory. We're given the flesh of animals from such an early age by all the forces that my teachers, my mother, my father, my relatives, my neighbors, my ministers, the media, everybody is just, this is what it is. And so to actually be able to question that. I remember I was watching some ducks in Switzerland at one point on a lake, and I realized that what was happening was the mother was teaching the little babies what food is, how to eat and what to eat. And I realized that every species, this is the most important thing, that you just don't question your mother's food, right, and your father's food. And so what we're doing, though, really, I think as we begin to raise our consciousness, is we begin to do that. And it takes a lot of character, I think, to actually be able to do that. But I would say there's nothing more powerful that anyone can do in terms of creating a foundation in this culture where peace and sustainability and justice and freedom and equality are actually possible than to switch to a plant-based diet for ethical reasons. To say no, basically, to paying for violence and brutality and domination and exploitation and disconnectedness and oppression and all of that entails. This massive war machine. I call it the military-industrial, meat-medical-pharmaceutical media complex. Now, there's this huge complex that's in place, and the driving fury at the core of this culture is the routine abuse of animals for food, and it's covered up. And when it's covered up, you can't face it. There's an old saying in the Zen tradition, that which you most forcefully ignore will control you the most. You know, this is the basic thing. You know, what we most forcefully ignore will control us the most. And this is what this culture most forcefully ignores. We will bend every which way to avoid looking at the ramifications of our mistreatment of animals for food. And what the World Peace Diet is mainly about is just exploring these ramifications. And it's fascinating and it's amazingly liberating. And I don't have time this evening to just go into all that. I'll try to do it a little bit right now, but it's really an adventure. You know, if you want to understand this culture, if you want to understand yourself, if I want to understand myself, I have to understand my culture, because I live in a culture, but that culture also lives in me. It's programmed my way of thinking about everything, myself, my language, relationships, everything. So if we want to understand ourselves, we have to understand our culture. If we want to understand our culture, we have to understand the food. We have to understand the dark side of the food. I mean, the hidden side. And when we begin to look at that, we begin to see that there is a doorway that we can go through to liberation. That this culture, we are not that far from a complete revolution. It's possible. There's nothing stopping us from a positive, benevolent transformation and revolution of this culture to leaping to a whole other level. Once we just get this about the food and about animals having their own interests and beings who are marginalized having their interests, starving people. This is the thing. And to live, and the whole thing is about one thing. It's about bringing our behavior so it's congruent with our beliefs, not believing one thing and acting something else. You know, that's totally disempowering. It's about living our beliefs. If we believe in freedom and equality and justice, then we are called to live that in our daily lives. And that's what veganism is. So veganism is a word. I'm going to talk a little bit about veganism. It's a word coined by Donald Watson in 1944. He was I think the secretary or something of the Vegetarian Society in England, and he wanted a word that was short because he was tired of typing vegetarian over and over again, and he wanted a word that accounted for motivation. That was the main thing. So he said this. He said, veganism is a philosophy and way of life which seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. That's what it is. It's simply the yearning to live my life to reduce or minimize the amount of cruelty and violence I'm causing to other living beings. Does that sound all that radical? I mean, how many people wake up in the morning and think, oh, I can't wait to be cruel and violent to somebody today? You know, veganism is our essential nature. It's our essential wisdom. What veganism is, it's nothing to be proud of. We're not better than anyone. What veganism is simply coming home to our true home, to our true nature, and looking out of eyes that see beings to be honored and respected, rather than seeing commodities to be abused and violated as objects, as things, as just things, as pieces of meat. It's simply looking with eyes that see what is as what is, and our natural compassion is at work. It'll work. And our culture has to work very hard to numb us down, to slow us down, and to make us into people who are willing to engage in this kind of violence. But once we begin to resensitize ourselves, once we connect with our intuition, which is our inner wisdom, and we begin to see the interconnectedness of all life, and we begin to touch into the essential wisdom of all the spiritual traditions of the world, which is whatever you sow, you will reap. Whatever we put out will come back, right? I mean, this is something we know in our bones. We're not going to, if we plant carrots, seeds, we're going to get carrots. If we plant actions of violence, it will come back as disease, as fear, as terror. If we plant seeds of caring and protection and love, it will come back as joy and as harmony in our relationships. So, what I do in the World Peace Diet, maybe I'll just go through this briefly, is go through the different dimensions of how this understanding plays out. The first chapter is called Food's Power. It's about basically just what I've been saying, that food is really powerful. We have a tendency in this culture to think that food is no big deal. You know, we're eating while we're driving, we're eating while we're watching television, we're eating while we're doing business meetings. You know, we're not even paying attention to whatever we're sticking in our mouth. But that's the result of many centuries of the kind of materialism and violence towards animals. We get disconnected. So food is so powerful. And once we understand this spiritually, I have a lot of examples from different traditions that go into that. But anyway, then the next chapter is, I think, very interesting. It's about the history of the whole thing. And it's called The Roots, Our Culture's Roots. And I'll just say this briefly because a lot of people I think we have this tendency to think that we've always had war, we've always had men dominating women, we've always had this kind of like these problems, right? And so they're just insoluble. And the truth is that I believe, anyway, this is what it seems to me from the anthropological record. Our culture went through a revolution 10,000 years ago in what is today Iraq. And all the so-called revolutions since that time were not revolutions. The Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, they're not revolutions. We can kill more animals and eat more animals than ever, right? But 10,000 years ago in Iraq, people for the very first time started to own animals for food. First it was wild sheep, and then it was wild goats, and then it was, I think, it was about 2,000 years later, it was cattle. And this, I believe, was an incredibly powerful revolution, change. And it was a slow revolution. It did not happen overnight. It took many, many centuries. It actually took thousands of years for this revolution to happen. And what happened was a number of things happened. The main thing that happened was that wild animals in general, were reduced from being mysterious cohabitants of the earth with us to being mere property, to being mere commodities that were owned. They became things. And today, there's nothing worse you can say to someone than say, you pig, you cow, you turkey, you chicken. These animals, these beings have been reduced because we always have to reduce beings in our estimation if we're going to harm them. So wild animals were reduced. The animals that were herded were reduced, and they were no longer respected. And the so-called wild animals also were reduced because they became pests, right? The coyotes and the wolves and the bears and everything else could somehow maybe in some ways threaten our livestock. And also, these owned animals became wealth. They were the wealth. They were the wealth. They were the word capital, for example. I mean, the whole arising of capitalism. These were the first proto-capitalists. Capital means capita. I mean, capita means head, right? As in head of livestock. So we had a new system emerging, and again, it took thousands of years, but a wealthy elite emerged. This powerful elite was powerful and wealthy for one reason. They owned capital. They owned heads. They owned livestock. And the fastest way for them to get rich quick, to get more wealth and more land and so forth, was to go to war. So it was to attack another elite guy who had a lot of livestock. And so they had the very first wars. The wars never happened before this time, in the sense that we think of it as these large-scale battles. And the very first word for war, in fact, on the planet, is the old Sanskrit word gavya, which literally means the desire for more cows. That's the first word for war. And when they would go to a war, and if they won the war, then basically all that livestock would become their property, would increase their wealth, and the women in that culture would become their concubines, and the males would typically be castrated like they did the male animals and become slaves. And so you had the first slavery, and the women, and the real domination of women, because women up until that point were highly respected because they did something men could never do. They brought forth new life. But when men started, the thing to understand is this revolution was so profound. The first science was men learning how, figuring out how to manipulate animals, female animals, to manipulate them and get their babies, and get babies that would give more milk and more meat and more wool. And so they were just messing with these animals and dominating them. And women, by the time the historic period emerged, right, 3,000 years ago, if you just read, these are the classes I used to teach, mythology, read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the earliest writings in the Old Testament. They all describe the culture that had emerged by that point, and it's a culture where women are bought and sold like chattel property. There's a wealthy, powerful elite that own the livestock. There's this horrific warfare going on, And men have to disconnect from their natural compassion, become capable of sustained violence and cruelty to animals that are very powerful. From the very beginning, basically, there's been two kinds of agriculture. There's been plant agriculture and animal agriculture. Plant agriculture basically brings out the best in us. It's been essentially from the very beginning, it's been women's work. It's working with the cycles of nature. It's working with the miracle of life, bringing forth new life, the incredible abundance of life-giving life, and the bounty and fertility. And from the very beginning, animal agriculture has been essentially man's work. It's brought the worst out of men. The animals from the very beginning have been resisting this. They do not want to be confined. They do not want to have their babies stolen. They do not want to be killed. They resist however they can. Men have to confine them, castrate them, kill them, steal the babies from their mothers. And it's just brought out the worst in men from the very beginning. And so this culture that developed was a very belligerent, bellicose culture, and it kept taking over and conquering other cultures and spreading relentlessly throughout the whole Mediterranean. It spread to Europe. They came here. They didn't just come here by themselves. They brought their whole thing with the livestock. And it's still spreading today. It's spreading through ConAgra, Monsanto, McDonald's, Burger King, Cargill, this whole, what I call again, the military, industrial, meat, medical, pharmaceutical, media complex. And we're born into that culture, and that culture, I have nothing against that culture. I mean, if people thought 10,000 years ago they had to do that for some reason, whatever. But the underlying assumptions of that culture today are insane for us to be living that. But the thing is, at the end of the day, those people, the wealthy elite of those people, sat down and ate the flesh and secretions of confined, brutalized animals, and that was their reward at the end of the day. That's what they ate. And that's what cemented that mentality, and we are doing the same thing today. We're eating, in fact, it's because of a variety of scientific so-called breakthroughs, it's not just the wealthy elite that's eating that way. It's, in this country, it's almost everyone, and because of the subsidies from the government. And so this is a pervasive mentality. But I would say that the reason we've had so much difficulty making actual progress over the last, centuries in what we've been trying, think about it, we've been trying to create a society where there's peace, where there's equality, where there's harmony, where we show some wisdom in our relationships with each other and with nature. Why are we so inept? Why are we so utterly inept? Why are we so incredibly foolish? How can we devastate this planet, and how can we violently brutalize each other? So we're eating the same food, and we're eating the same mentality. We're disconnected from our essential wisdom. The thing to understand is, when you go out this door and you see people eating animal foods, there's not one person in this culture that's doing it from their own choice. No one is doing it from their own free will. Everyone is doing it for one reason. They were forced into it as they were growing up, and they're forced into it continually. The barrage from the media is relentless. The barrage from the medical establishment and pharmaceutical establishment from every angle is virtually relentless. So people are forced into this. And the thing to understand is, whatever we do to animals, we always do to ourselves. It always ends up boomeranging back. If we enslave animals, we will be and are enslaved. If we inflict terror and brutality on them, the same thing happens. What we sow comes back, because we have this idea somehow that, they're just animals, they don't matter. And, people, I don't have to remind you that people have said that, a couple hundred years ago in the United States about black people who were held as slaves. Well, they don't matter. And we look back on that and we say, what an incredibly dark, benighted time that was. How could people think like that, Well, look at this. We're doing the same thing. We have to realize beings have interests, and their interests are valuable to them. And the essential teaching of all the religions is of the interconnectedness of all life. The essential interconnectedness of all life. And so what veganism is pointing at really is a very beautiful and empowering vision of compassion for all life and living that way. And what I realized in doing the research for the World Peace Diet is that there are, as we begin to bring our life into alignment with that, everything works better and better. And so let's see. The next few chapters just talk about how we come in our culture to eat animal foods, and the forces that go into that, and one of the things I won't go into all that, but one thing I'll just mention that I think is very interesting, actually, is this idea that I already mentioned briefly, and I'll go into it a little bit more now, of as you sow, so shall you reap. The idea that every single problem, actually, that our culture is facing, we are actively inflicting on animals. So what we're sowing comes back. And I'll give a few examples. There's a lot of them in the book, but I'll just give a few. One that's really, kind of interesting is obesity. If you look at a graph of obesity, it's just up, it's just increasing. And if you look at the graph of what the agribusiness has been able to do for the weight of animals, that they're slaughtering, it's following the same graph. They're sold by the pound. They're given, animals that are eaten for food, these 75 million animals that are killed every day in this society are given special diets, given special drugs to make them as fat as possible, as quickly as possible, because they're sold by the pound. So we sow obesity in them, and we reap obesity in ourselves. Osteoporosis is another very interesting one. It strikes mainly women, right? It's female animals, especially dairy cows and chickens, for the hens that are used for eggs. We force them to overproduce milk and eggs. There's a lot of calcium in milk and in egg shells. And so these female animals get severe osteoporosis because, by forcing them to overproduce, the calcium is being sucked out of their bodies, and they have severe osteoporosis. A dairy cow, for example, would live in the wild typically 25 years. After 4 years, maybe at the most 5 years, they are worn out. They're sent off to slaughter, and slaughterhouse workers say they can break their bones in their bare hands. They have such severe osteoporosis. The downers we hear about, the downer cows, there's dairy cows whose bones just break under them because they have such severe osteoporosis. Same thing with chickens that are used in egg operations. They force them to overproduce eggs, and they also, their bones break under them, but they just throw them around. They're not like heavy cows. But the question that I think is interesting to ask is, how do you get these cows to overproduce? And how do you get these chickens to overproduce? The way you get cows, for example, to overproduce, give so much, like a cow would normally give milk in a bell curve up to about 25 pounds of milk a day, and then tapering off back to zero in about 4 or 5 months. And then when her calf starts eating regular food. On a typical dairy today, cows are giving over 110 pounds of milk a day for a longer period of time. And they're doing it while they're pregnant with the next baby. See, what happens is they're given special drugs to bring them into heat early on. Then they're put on a rape rack and raped. Then after 9 months of carrying this baby, they give birth. The baby is immediately stolen. Even on organic dairies, the baby is given blood rather than milk to drink. And then they're impregnated again, and then they're given progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, oxytocin, a lot of different hormones to make them give more milk. Plus, the scientists discovered that if you feed a dairy cow flesh of other animals, give them meat, they'll give more milk. And so you have a situation in the United States where dairy cows are eating more fish than human beings are. And it's comical to think of a dairy cow gallivanting in a stream trying to catch a fish, something like that. But they're eating huge quantities of fish. They're eating huge quantities of chickens, pigs, typically other cows, chicken litter, roadkill, dogs, cats, all that stuff. It's all ground up at the render. It's fed back. It's called enriching their feed. And this is how you get the cows to give so much milk, is feeding meat to them and giving them a lot of drugs. And this is what causes osteoporosis in them, and we find the situation of people getting osteoporosis. And all the things that we're doing to these animals, they're so perverse and they're so violent, and we find it comes back to us. For example, the pharmaceutical corporations of this country, there's over 10,000 different pharmaceuticals that are approved for use against on animals for food, and we find these animals are given all these different pharmaceuticals, and then they're making huge profits giving pharmaceuticals to human beings for the same kinds of things that the animals have. I mean, the biggest selling drugs are drugs for what these animals are experiencing, and we end up experiencing it ourselves. For anxiety, for frustration, for depression, for panic attacks, for insomnia. These are the things that are huge sellers, as well, of course, as statin drugs and things for eating all the cholesterol and saturated fat of animal foods themselves. So whatever we sow, we inflict drugs on them. We find drugs. In fact, this whole thing with mandatory vaccinations, I guess you all know that's coming. Well, that's what we're inflicting on these animals, mandatory vaccinations. The cow doesn't say, well, I don't think I'm going to take that one today, No chance. So the electroprods, that we use on these animals, they're incredibly painful. And I remember when Bush back, said we want to do torture on prisoners and not leave any marks on them. And they use a lot of electropods, as you know, on other human beings. So, whatever we've been doing to these animals, we end up doing to ourselves, to each other, and war, terrorism. The breakdown of the family is an extremely serious problem in this culture. I would say probably one of the worst problems that we're facing. And look what we're doing to these animals. There is no family allowed for these billions of animals that we're hyper-confining. The babies are always separated from the mothers. Every single animal is reduced to a lone unit of production in a heartless economic system. That's what we do to them. And I find more and more people going, yeah, I feel like a lone unit of production in a heartless economic system myself, Of course. How can we think that we're above the cosmic laws of the universe? What we sow will come back. If we're sowing seeds of misery and violence and brutality, we're not going to reap joy and happiness. So this is very elementary, basic stuff that our culture is completely oblivious to, and you can't even talk about. It's amazing to me, for example, when you just think about this, that I could go through myself, for example, an entire cycle of education. I could get a master's degree, a Ph.D. at UC Berkeley, which at that time was the #1 ranked school of education in North America, reading hundreds, thousands of books and articles in a wide variety, and reading the most progressive and the most radical, authors. And never once in that entire time, many, many years of study and education, read even one sentence that said, maybe the reason we have the problems we have is the routine violence towards animals for food. It's an unthinkable thought. Even Noam Chomsky or whoever, Herbert Marcuse or Karl Marx, I don't know, think of anybody, Deepak Chopra, whoever it is, no one, it's just not. Anyway, so it's like we have to realize that we have been living in like this strange vacuum where the most obvious thing is undiscussable. Talk about the elephant in the living room. And so anyway, there's a chapter. And then there's a chapter that talks about the intelligence of human physiology, which is actually the longest chapter in the book. It's just like, what are we actually designed to eat? That's a basic question, because most people say, oh, we're designed to eat meat or something. So I just go into that question very in depth. The whole health, all the health ramifications of eating animal fat, cholesterol, saturated, animal protein, how the toxins concentrate in animal flesh and secretions and so forth. Madeline and I we have not, neither one of us have been to a doctor in over 35 years. It's really liberating. It's so liberating. We don't even go to a drugstore. You don't need to. All the stuff they have, all the, whatever it is, aspirin and Tylenol and Brightguard and Viagra and Tums and Alka-Seltzer and what's that stuff they have for constant X-Lax? People, we have to realize that we're essentially, our bodies are wonderful. They will just do the best they can with whatever we give them, for food. But if we eat foods that we're designed for, and the beauty is that this is a beautiful thing. All of us are given this wonderful gift of bodies that require no living being to suffer to feed them. And yet somehow we take that gift and we throw it back in the face of the Creator and say, well, we're going to kill animals and eat them anyway. And so just to really understand deeply about our physiology, I think is really helpful. And there's a chapter that goes into, it's called Hunting and Herding Sea Life, which is what we're doing to the oceans and fish. And I'm telling you, I've been to factory farm fish operations. I don't know if any of you have been to these places. It's called aquaculture. It's amazing. I've seen both outdoor ones and indoor ones. The indoor ones are in these gigantic stinking sheds, and there's huge swimming pools. And I remember just looking into the water, and I thought, it took me quite a while to even realize there was anything there. I thought it was just I mean, it looked just like black water with nothing in it. I remember looking at just like this thick black water. And then as I kept looking and my eyes got accustomed to seeing what was there, I realized that it was absolutely packed with fish. I mean, the fish were just crammed in there, and they could hardly even move, and they were swimming in their own feces. That's why the water was black. And then the workers were coming by, and they were dumping chemicals and antibiotics and other things in there to try to keep these poor fish alive long enough they could rip them out of the water and electrocute them. And then people eat this stuff, and they think they're getting their healthy omega-3s, and don't realize the incredible amount of violence, brutality, and toxins that are concentrating in these animals that are hyper-confined. The oceans are being completely devastated by fishing. I have a whole chapter on it. I think it's one of the most essential things to understand is about fish and what we're doing to the oceans. And this unimaginable wastefulness of our food system. I mean, it's almost like the environmental effects of this are mind-blowing. It's almost like there's a chapter later in the book called Profiting from Destruction, which just goes into that whole thing of the environmental effects. But I'm telling you, when you're finished reading this, the basic thing is when it's supremely inefficient to feed massive amounts of grain to animals, and then the manure that they're creating. I just read today the amount of manure, 2 billion tons. I mean, these are like huge numbers of manure. It's the livestock just in the United States creates more manure than the human population of the entire planet. One big pig factory farm creates more manure than than a city the size of New York City. So what we're doing is creating massive amounts of pollution, using massive amounts of water and land and petroleum, and creating environmental devastation, global warming, species extinction, rampant from the devastation of habitat. And this is the driving force behind all of the environmental problems that we're having is animal agriculture. But you wouldn't know that from the media. But it's true. When you look deep enough, you'll see it. You will really find that out. And yet we're not allowed to talk to that. And I talk about it, and the feeling I have is that if we took our most celebrated scientists and just gave them a thought experiment, said, okay, listen, fellas, just for the heck of it, think up a system that would maximize disease, maximize environmental devastation, maximize sheer suffering of living beings, maximize disconnectedness and pain and social malaise and insanity and spiritual numbing. You couldn't come up with a better system than what we have of feeding billions of animals, cutting down forests, growing monocropped grains so that nothing can grow there. No plants or animals except one species can grow. It's just a poisoned fields. Feeding that to animals and eating that and feeding it to our children, you couldn't come up with a better system. And yet what that system does do very well is it concentrates wealth in the hands of a few people. It does that very well. And it disempowers people very well. You have people who can't think about what they're doing. We feel so... one of the essential things to understand is self-esteem. Self-esteem is devastated by eating animals for food. There's a real problem. People who have strong self-esteem are not easily controlled. People with low self-esteem want to be consumers. They want to somehow fill that inner void with stuff, And so if we want to create a culture where we have some sense of nobility, of respect, of compassion for each other, and where peace is actually possible because we honor life, then we have to look at the food, at the mentality required by our food. That is the essential key. And so anyway, there's a chapter that follows that, which in a sense is the heart and soul of the whole thing. It's called The Domination of the Feminine. The basic idea is, in the ancient Greek tradition, there was a goddess called Sophia. And Sophia is within us. Sophia is our own feminine wisdom. It's the wisdom of protecting life and of nurturing life. And what from the very beginning of this whole project of dominating animals for food and owning them, it's always been the female animals that have been most severely brutalized. It's always been the female animals because they're the ones that give birth and have the babies, and so they've been the ones that have been... The thing has been to dominate and oppress and use them the most viciously. And so And the thing is that all of us know, we all feel this in our bones, that if there's anything at all that we should honor and respect, it's mothers giving birth to their babies, nursing those babies, protecting them, nesting with them, that we should, let that happen. You should just kind of, give that some space, give that some respect, and not mess with that. But that is the very thing that with the worst, most vicious iron fist we brutalized. Those babies are stolen, those mothers are raped, and the babies are stolen. It's their reproductive organs, it's their vaginas and their mammary glands that are most brutalized and manipulated and exploited. And so what that's done is it's killed out Sophia in us. We can destroy this planet because we don't care. Our Sophia has been devastated by eating dairy products and eggs. We don't care about the feminine dimension. We don't care about this beautiful miracle of life bringing forth new life. I mean, you think about it. What is more beautiful than a baby being born and the potential of that, celebrating their life? What do you think of a little chicken inside of an egg, and she's just trying to get out. Oh, I want to get out, and she finally gets out. And she's at a hatchery, and she gets her beak chopped off, which very often they just die right on the spot. It's such a shock, or it's chronic pain forever. Or if it's a male, they're just ground up and fed back to the females. I mean, this is what we do, and life is bursting forth, and we're just killing it. We're violating it at the very core of our being. What is that? It's not only bad for the animals, it's terrible for us. How can we create a world of peace when we're acting like this to billions of animals? I mean, this is the essential dilemma. I called it in the book before Michael Pollan ever came up with this idea. It's the unyielding dilemma of this culture. And if we don't look at this, we're doomed. We will go extinct. We'll destroy ourselves, and we'll never even know why it happened. Because the essential mentality that's running rampant is a mentality of disconnectedness and oppression towards other living beings that we reinforce every day through our meals. And it's this feminine dimension, I think, that can save us. I mean, it's this feminine dimension that's still alive, and what going vegan really is. It's when this intuition, which is our inner spiritual wisdom, flashes forth and we say, no, I'm not going to pay for that. And that no, and most people think of vegans like, oh man, you're always saying no, right? You're no fun. You say no ice cream, no cheese, no milk, no whatever, no cheeseburgers, no fish sticks. But those no's actually ride on a much bigger yes. It's a yes to compassion for other living beings. It's a yes to taking responsibility for the ripples that radiate into the world. It's a yes to kindness and benevolence and goodwill and freedom and peace and joy. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a huge yes. And that is the most subversive action anyone can take to the violence inherent in this culture, is to go vegan. I mean, there's nothing more powerful. There's no statement you can make more powerful than to say no to that spinning fury at the core of our culture, which is driving us ever onward in blindness. And and it's Sophia, I think, that's our great ally. It's this inner feminine. Most people go vegan not just from logic. It's an inner. They just get it. It's like an inner something happens, and we feel it, and we know I'm not gonna pay someone to kill this animal, and that's basically coming home. So there's there's a chapter on it's called the Metaphysics of Food, which goes basically into this idea that we're not just eating physical toxins when we eat animal products, we're eating metaphysical toxins. We're not just eating concentrations of PCBs and heavy metals and all the hormones and all the other horrible things that are in animal foods. We're also eating fear and terror and panic and frustration and grief and sadness and despair. And why is it? Why else would it be that we're finding such an epidemic of these things rampant in this culture? Because we're eating that, we're feeding that to our children. And children are very sensitive to energy. So I really think it's important to look at not just the materialist level, but the level of the spiritual level. There's a chapter called Reductionist Science and Religion, which just shows that science and religion are portrayed as being sort of enemies with each other, but actually they're what I call the two sons of the herding culture. They're bickering brothers. They're basically very much in agreement. They both are promoting using animal foods, and they both attack Sophia. That's their enemy, both of them. So what we're talking about is really a deep level revolution in our culture. there's a chapter called Some Objections Answered, because most people, when they hear these ideas, have a certain sort of rote objections that they make, like, well, Jesus was a meat eater, so it must be right, or animals, are no different from plants. I mean, plants feel pain, so do animals, so it's all the same, whatever you eat, or whatever. People have different objections. I answer all those objections in the book. I mean, I don't know if I answer all of them, but I answer a lot of them. And I think it's really helpful to really think deeply through these things, because I think we're called to be effective in our advocacy for animals, because it's really advocacy not just for animals, but for starving people, for ourselves, for life. It's advocacy of the most essential, glorious nature, actually. It's advocacy for life. I mean, what are we here on this planet to do? Why are we here? We're here, I think, aren't we, to find our unique way of blessing the world and to bring that forth? And what could be a greater blessing than this? So there's a chapter on the objections. And then there's some other chapters. There's one on work and how not only does this hurt women, but it really hurts men. My essential message is enormously positive, because we can transform this culture. When we change the way we eat and when we spread that message, we are creating a whole new culture. Imagining our culture as a vegan culture is imagining a totally different culture, completely different. It's wonderful to think about that. Just wonderful to think about when people stop eating so much meat and dairy and eggs, and when forests can come back and the ecosystems come back and people can be fed. I mean, we can turn everything around. It's not at all out of we're not essentially evil, corrupt, warlike, exploitive, horrible people. We're essentially beings of compassion, wisdom, and love, born into a culture that's been enslaved to a mentality that's obsolete. We don't have to fight that mentality. All we have to do is go vegan, create beautiful food. How many of you in here already consider yourselves vegans or vegetarians? Some of you, yeah. So you already know a lot about this. And there's a lot more I could talk about with this whole thing, but the basic thing I want to say here in just closing is that in my own life, I was born in a typical family in New England. I remember growing up, we ate the usual huge quantities of meat, dairy, and eggs. I remember asking my mother when I was about 7 years old, I said, "Mom, is this what everybody eats?" And my mother said, "Yes, this is what everybody eats." And then she went, "Well, there are vegetarians." And I got the message. It was like, they live on another planet. You will never even meet one in your entire life. They're sort of hypothetical people. I mean, where would they get their protein? All right, so I think it's time to wrap it up here. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tuttle. I hope you're not ready to leave us now that you've written your book. Okay, stay with us. Okay, thank you, Dr. Tuttle, for a very illuminating, thought-provoking talk tonight. Thank you all. Mahalo.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.